I've been a farmer my whole life, just like my father and his father before him. Our family has tended to these rolling fields for generations, raising cattle and growing crops under the vast Nebraska sky. My days are filled with the comforting routine of farm life, and my nights are usually a time for rest. That is, until last week. It was a Tuesday when I found the first steer. I remember because it was the day after a heavy storm, and I was out inspecting the damage to the fences. The morning sun was just beginning to break through the clouds, casting long shadows across the wet grass. As I approached the north pasture, I noticed something unusual. One of my steers was lying unnaturally still. My heart sank as I got closer. The poor creature was mutilated, its body torn open in a way I had never seen before. The wounds were precise, almost surgical, and there was barely any blood around. It didn't look like the work of any predator I knew. Coyotes or wolves would have left a mess, but this was different. I reported the incident to the local sheriff, who suggested it might be the work of a poacher or some sick prankster. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else, something darker. I doubled my efforts to secure the fences and even brought my old hunting rifle down from the attic, just in case. The following night, it happened again. This time, it was one of the younger steers, found in nearly the same condition as the first. The same precise cuts, the same eerie lack of blood. I was at my wit's end. I knew I had to do something, or I'd lose my entire herd. On the third night, I decided to take matters into my own hands. Armed with my rifle and a flashlight, I set up a makeshift camp near the pasture. The night was cool, and a full moon cast an otherworldly glow over the fields. I settled into my post, listening to the familiar sounds of the farm, the gentle lowing of cattle, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, the occasional hoot of an owl. Hours passed, and the night grew darker and quieter. I fought to keep my eyes open, the repetitive chorus of crickets lulling me toward sleep. Then, just as my eyelids began to droop, I heard it, a strange, low, humming sound. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew steadily louder. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the pasture with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The cattle were restless, shifting uneasily as the hum grew into a vibration that I could feel in my bones. I gripped my rifle tighter, trying to steady my shaking hands. Then I saw it. At the far end of the pasture, a dark shape was moving among the cattle. It was tall and thin, with elongated limbs that seemed to glide above the ground. The flashlight beam caught a glimpse of something metallic and reflective, but the shape moved so quickly it was hard to make out any details. I forced myself to move, my legs feeling like lead. As I approached, the humming grew louder, almost deafening, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The creature, or whatever it was, turned toward me, and I saw its eyes, large, black, and soulless, like twin voids absorbing all light. It let out a shrill, piercing sound that sent the cattle into a frenzy. I raised my rifle and fired, the sound of the shot echoing across the fields. The creature vanished in a blur of motion, and the humming stopped abruptly. Silence fell over the pasture, broken only by the panicked cries of the cattle. I stood there, trembling, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Whatever that thing was, it was gone, for now. But I knew it would be back. The mutilations, the strange sounds, the creature's terrifying appearance. It was all too much to ignore. I needed to find out what was happening and protect my herd. The next day, I reinforced the fences even further and called in some favors from neighboring farmers. We set up cameras and motion sensors around the pasture, hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature if it returned. I spent the following nights in the same spot, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Days turned into weeks, and there were no more attacks. The cameras captured nothing but the usual wildlife, and the motion sensors remained silent. I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing, if the stress of losing my cattle had gotten to me. But deep down, I knew the truth. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that something is out there, watching and waiting. The farm has returned to its usual rhythm, but the nights feel different. Every rustle of the wind, every distant sound in the darkness sends a shiver down my spine. I can't let my guard down, not ever again. I don't know what that creature was or why it targeted my farm, but I do know one thing. There are things in this world we are not meant to understand, and sometimes the darkness holds more than just shadows. Life on the farm was always predictable. The sun rose, the rooster crowed, and I started my day tending to the animals and the fields. My wife, Clara, and I lived a simple, peaceful life on our farm in rural Indiana, miles away from the nearest town. It wasn't always easy, but it was the life we chose and loved. One cold November evening, I was fixing the fence along the eastern pasture when I noticed something odd. There was a pile of freshly turned soil not far from the fence line, about the size of a small grave. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I shrugged it off as an animal burrowing for winter. Later that night, as Claire and I sat by the fireplace, I heard a faint tapping at the window. Clara dismissed it as the wind, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me since I found the mound of dirt. I went to the window and peered into the darkness, but saw nothing. The next morning, I found another mound, this time closer to the barn. It was identical to the first, freshly dug, with no apparent reason for its presence. I checked on the animals and walked the perimeter of the farm, but there were no signs of intruders. Just an eerie silence that seemed to hang over everything. By the third day, Clara was getting worried. She had noticed the mounds too, and now strange things were happening around the house. We would hear footsteps on the porch late at night, and once I found the barn door open, even though I was sure I had locked it. Something was out there, watching us. That night, I decided to stay up and keep watch. I sat by the window with a thermos of coffee and my shotgun close at hand. The hours ticked by slowly, the farmhouse filled with the creaks and groans of old wood settling. Around midnight, I heard it again, the soft, deliberate tapping at the window. I turned off the lamp and edged closer to the glass, trying to see into the darkness without being seen. At first, there was nothing, just the black expanse of the fields and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the yard, just beyond the reach of the porch light. It was tall and thin, with a hunched posture, as if it were trying to make itself smaller. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched it. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching the house. I raised my shotgun, my hands shaking, and stepped out onto the porch. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure didn't respond, didn't move an inch. I walked slowly toward it, my flashlight in one hand, the shotgun in the other. As I got closer, the figure seemed to dissolve into the night, leaving nothing but the cold wind in its place. The next morning, I found another mound of dirt, right where the figure had been standing. Clara and I were both on edge, and we decided to call the sheriff. He came out and took a look around, but there was nothing concrete to report. No footprints, no signs of struggle, just the eerie mounds of dirt. The sheriff suggested it might be kids playing a prank, or maybe a drifter passing through. He promised to keep an eye out, and left us with a promise to patrol more frequently. But that didn't make us feel any safer. The sense of being watched, of something sinister lurking just out of sight, was overwhelming. The following night, I set up a few traps around the property and kept watch again. This time, I saw the figure more clearly. It was the same tall, thin shape, but now I could make out more details. The figure was wearing tattered clothes, and its face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. It moved slowly, deliberately, and this time it was closer to the house. I shouted again, but it didn't react. Instead, it turned and disappeared into the cornfield. I chased after it, but by the time I reached the edge of the field, it was gone. I searched the rows of corn, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was no trace of the figure. As I walked back to the house, I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about the way the figure moved, the way it seemed to vanish into thin air, didn't sit right with me. I knew it wasn't a prankster or a drifter. This was something else, something more sinister. The next day, I decided to dig up one of the mounds. Clara watched from the porch, her face pale and worried. As I shoveled away the dirt, I uncovered something that made my blood run cold. A small, crude doll, made of straw and wrapped in a piece of cloth. It had no face, but it was unmistakably human in shape. I showed it to Clara, and we both knew we were dealing with something beyond our understanding. We called the sheriff again, and he took the doll, promising to investigate further. But I could see the doubt in his eyes. He didn't believe us. That night, the tapping at the window returned, louder and more insistent. The figure appeared again, standing at the edge of the yard, watching us. This time, Clara and I didn't hesitate. We packed a few things and drove into town, leaving the farm behind. We stayed with friends for a few days, hoping the sheriff would find something. But when we returned, the farm was eerily quiet. The mounds of dirt were gone, the figure was nowhere to be seen, and everything seemed normal. Almost too normal. We tried to resume our lives, but the feeling of being watched never left us. The tapping at the window continued. The figure appeared from time to time, and the sense of dread grew stronger. We knew we couldn't stay. In the end, we sold the farm and moved away, hoping to leave the terror behind. But even now, in our new home, I sometimes hear the faint sound of tapping at the window, and I wonder if we ever truly escaped. Because some horrors are not bound by place. They follow you, haunt you, no matter where you go. And the watchful eyes, they never blink. I moved to the farm in the summer of '97, drawn by the promise of solitude and a simpler life. The old farmhouse, with its weathered boards and sagging roof, seemed to whisper stories of the past, tales long forgotten by time. It stood on the edge of a sprawling cornfield, a sea of green that rustled in the wind, creating an almost hypnotic rhythm. Little did I know that rhythm would soon become a harbinger of terror. The first few weeks were peaceful. I spent my days repairing the farmhouse, planting a small garden, and exploring the land. The nearest neighbor was miles away, a fact I relished. It was just me and the land, untouched by the chaos of modern life. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I decided to take a walk through the cornfield. The tall stalks towered over me, their leaves brushing against my skin. The air was cool, and the silence was comforting. As I ventured deeper into the field, a sense of unease settled over me. The rustling of the corn seemed to grow louder, more insistent. I shrugged it off as my imagination, but I quickened my pace, eager to return to the safety of the farmhouse. That's when I saw it, a dark shape, moving swiftly between the rows of corn. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was too large to be an animal, but I couldn't make out any details. I called out, but my voice sounded small and insignificant in the vast field. The shape vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. I hurried back to the farmhouse, locking the door behind me. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the setting sun. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the night. The usual chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl seemed to fade away, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the front porch. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight from my bedside table and crept downstairs. The front door was shut tight, but the tapping persisted. I hesitated for a moment before flinging the door open. There was nothing. The porch was empty, the cornfield beyond swaying gently in the breeze. I shone the flashlight around, illuminating the weathered boards and the rusty old chair, but there was no sign of what had made the noise. I shut the door and bolted it, my mind racing. The next few days were uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I went about my chores with a growing sense of dread, constantly looking over my shoulder. At night, the tapping would return, sometimes on the windows, sometimes on the walls. It was driving me mad. One evening, determined to get to the bottom of it, I decided to stay up and keep watch. I armed myself with a shotgun and settled into a chair by the front door, my eyes fixed on the darkened windows. Hours passed, and just as I was beginning to think it was all in my head, the tapping started again, this time louder and more insistent. I burst through the door, the shotgun at the ready, and saw it, the dark shape, standing at the edge of the cornfield. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch out in all directions. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and it was watching me. I raised the shotgun and fired, but the shape vanished before the pellets could reach it. I stumbled back into the house, slamming the door shut. The tapping resumed immediately, now all around me, as if the very walls were alive. Panic set in. I grabbed my keys and ran to the truck, desperate to leave the farm behind. But as I reached the driveway, the engine sputtered and died. I was trapped. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the farmhouse, the tapping growing louder and more frenzied. It felt like an eternity before the first light of dawn broke through the windows, and with it, the tapping ceased. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. As soon as the truck started, I drove away, leaving the farm and its haunted cornfield behind. I never looked back. Even now, years later, I can still hear the tapping in my dreams, a relentless reminder of the terror I faced on that forsaken farm. And I know, somewhere out there, it's still waiting, hidden in the shadows, watching.